effectively what was a let them drown policy has produced many hundreds of deaths. Do you regret that original decision?
Well, I think it's true that the policy hasn't been working, which it's right to revisit the policy as we did yesterday in Brussels and put military resources in place, but also have a comprehensive strategy to go after the boats, go after the traffickers, go after this evil trade. I don't accept your version of how these events happened. I mean, what happened was, because of this evil trade, the Italians introduced the Mare Nostrum policy, which had European support. Then the Italians, because the numbers were going up, thought, well, that isn't working properly, and wanted to try a different approach, and that had European support. But frankly, that hasn't worked either, which is why it's right to revisit. But I wouldn't put the characterization that you've put on it.
But I asked you if you regretted it, because the fact is, whatever it was that you decided has yielded many, many hundreds of deaths.
Well, what I regret is that this trade is the responsibility of the traffickers and the gangs, and we need a strategy. Search and rescue is important, but it won't solve the problem alone.
We participated in the ending of a 40-year dictatorship in Libya, but the bombing that you authorized, you and the French, had no follow-up. There was no real follow-up,
I don't
no
accept
plan.
that. I mean, first of all, let's rewind. Why did we take the decision?
Because people in Benghazi were under siege.
Exactly,
yes.
Not just under siege. There was, the danger of a genocide taking place, as Gaddafi, in his own words, said he was going to go into Benghazi and kill his own people like rats. And the right decision was to stop him, and we did that.
But
I
you
don't
couldn't
accept
stop there. You couldn't stop there. There was no plan as to what to do next.
I don't accept that at all. After the end of the conflict, we met repeatedly with the Libyan authorities. I took the Libyan Prime Minister to the G8 meeting in Northern Ireland to get the whole of the most advanced countries in the world around the table with the Libyan Prime Minister. We all pledged, and Britain played its part in trying to train up Libyan security forces. We put aid money into Libya.
But we don't even have an embassy there now. I mean, it's an incredible state of affairs that we took this very big decision to throw bombs into another country, and at the end of the day, we did not stay the course and do anything.
I don't accept that we didn't have a plan. We did. The reason we had to take our embassy out is that it wasn't safe, and we are responsible for the safety of British people, and I couldn't leave the embassy there with the levels of terrorism and violence that were taking place. But I take responsibility.
There is this sort of axiom, which is, if you break it, you have to make it, and you haven't. You broke it, but nothing's happened.
Of course, you could make an argument to say, after the end of the war, Britain and other countries should have put troops on the ground in Libya to enforce a change and to get the politicians together. I happen to think that wouldn't have worked. We know in other countries where that's been tried, that often creates more resentment, more terrorism, more problems.
But we also know that bombing doesn't work.
Well,
I mean,
what we did stop Gaddafi carrying out a genocide, and that, I think, is important. What we've also tried to do is work with the Libyan authorities. We're still at it. I've still got Jonathan Powell, who used to work for the previous Labour government, as my envoy in Libya, trying to bring together the different parties, because we need a government of Libya. And our commitment is, we will put in the aid. We will help this country in its time of need. But, this is something the Libyan people have to do themselves as well.
Let's look at the domestic situation here then, now, because one of the things you were renowned for was holding the line on spending. And, you ran an austerity budget throughout the last
I call it
years.
living within our means. And
well,
progressively doing so, we've cut the deficit, confirmed yesterday in the figures, by more than half as a share of our economy, and we need to complete the job.
Quite suddenly, you're going around splashing it around. Splashing out all sorts of things.
That.
Well, I mean, you've got 7 billion promised on tax cuts. You've got 8 billion. You've got 8 billion promised on the NHS. Tell us how you're going to fund this. You're going to freeze rail prices
in
too.
The same
how
way.
Are you going to fund
we're going to do it in the same way we have in this Parliament that's just passed. In the Parliament that's just passed, we cut taxes by 10 billion. We increased spending on health service by 7 billion. We also made a £120 billion fiscal adjustment.
I'm talking about these pledges.
Yes, these pledges are less ambitious than what we did in the last
Parliament.
Parliament.
Still want to know how they're funded.
Well, they're funded out of our spending plans, just as we did in the last Parliament. The fiscal adjustment we need to make now is 30 billion compared to the previous 120 billion. So it's a quarter of the size.
Well, let's look at welfare, because again, you talk about 10 billion pounds of cuts. Actually, it's 12 billion, but you've already found, you say, 2.5 billion. But you're still going to find another 10. And that means £1,000 a year for 10 million hard-pressed people. How are you going to do it? Don't they deserve to know what those cuts are?
Well, first of all, what we're doing is half, effectively, of what we did in the last Parliament. In the last Parliament, we saved £21 billion of welfare spending, and we're saying we need to save 12 billion in this Parliament.
But these
and again,
are human beings
yes,
on benefits.
Absolutely, and I want to get more people off benefits and into work. And to give you one example, in the last Parliament we got 2 million people into work.
But I'm not questioning. The question I've asked you is,
right, what I'm trying to answer,
what are these benefits? What are these benefits? Because you haven't spelt that out.
If you give me a chance. So, first of all, if we can perform as we did in the last Parliament, we can get an extra 1 million people into work, which will cut the benefits bill. We're going to cut the welfare cap, take it down from 26,000 to 23,000. We're going to continue with the excellent work of universal credit, which leads to savings because it makes work pay.
Now, by saying that doing a deal with the SNP is really beyond the pale, and you're criticising Labour for any question of that, isn't that akin to saying that effectively you're saying the Scots themselves are beyond the pale?
No, not at all. Look, an SNP...
Well, if they vote for the SNP, and then you say they surely have every right to have the same say in Westminster as any of the rest of us.
Of course they do. I'm not denying that.
But you're saying nobody should do a deal for the party they vote with.
For this reason. If you have an SNP Member of Parliament has every much as right to attend Parliament and vote as I do as an English Member of Parliament. The point I'm making is that if you have a weak Labour government backed by SNP members in the House of Commons, you've effectively got nationalists from one part of the country who don't care about the rest of the country, who actually want the rest of the country to break up. That is a dangerous situation, and I think an intolerable situation for the rest of the country. And I'm calling that out because this is a fact of this election campaign.
But it still seems to be inconsistent to say to people, we're not going to do a deal with the SNP, even though those Scots people have voted for them. It sort of disenfranchises the Scots.
No, it isn't. As I say, the SNP have every right to sit in the House of Commons. But frankly, their aim, think about it like this. At the end of a 5-year Parliament, propping up Ed Miliband, does Nicola Sturgeon want to look back and say, that was a great Parliament, that was very successful at Westminster, my, how well this government's working? Of course not.
But she's not going to be in Westminster.
Well, her or Alex Salmond, any of them, they want Westminster to grind to a halt. They want the government, the country, to fail because they want to leave it. That's all I'm doing, is calling out to the British people to say, look, there's a way of avoiding this calamity, which is to vote Conservative on May the 7th.
Now, since I last had an interview with you, which was at the Tory Party conference, I've smoked skunk.
I watched a bit of the programme.
Well,
very
you will have
frightening
seen that it was
too.
a very horrible experience. And it is skunk, a form of marijuana, is nevertheless massively stronger than anything that you or I smoked when we were students. Now, the question I have is this. 25% of all diagnosed psychosis in London over the past 5 years, according to King's Hospital research, is skunk-related. Is there not a danger that we are literally backing into the most appalling mental health crisis?
I think this is a real danger. I don't therefore reach the conclusion that somehow legalising drugs and regulating them is right. I think that would lead to more usage and more problems. I think the answer is to keep the laws we have, but to do better on education and also to do better on treatment.
You could argue that it would be much safer to give the whole thing to SmithKline Beecham and ask them to sort out a decent, safe marijuana. People are going to go on smoking it.
I think the problem with that is that I think you'd find drug use would go up, and I don't think you can guarantee that skunk use would go down. So I think you could end up making the problem worse. As I say, I think the answers are education at the front end and treatment at the back end, and particularly helping with mental health, which for the first time now we've got these waiting time limits for psychological therapies that can make such a big difference.
Prime Minister, thanks very much.